Good evening and welcome to the Moral Economy Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew. This weekend, Firat Navats and I attended the New World Summit in Utrecht, Netherlands, discussing stateless democracy and democratic confederalism. During the conference, Firat Navats and I got a chance to sit down with two of the guest speakers. As an introduction to our guests, I will read a short biography from the summit. Nancy Hollander is a partner of the firm Friedman, Boyd, Hollander, Goldberg, Urias & Ward, P.A., since 1983. Her practice is largely devoted to criminal cases, including those involving U.S. national security issues. Hollander has been counsel in numerous civil cases, forfeitures, and administrative hearings, and has served as a consultant to the defense of a high-profile terrorism case in Ireland. She also represents two prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, one of which being Mohamedou Al-Salahi, whom she assisted in publishing his bestseller Guantanamo Diaries in 2015. Furthermore, she is lead counsel for whistleblower Chelsea Manning on appeal. In her 2010 article, A Terrorist Lawyer and Proud of It, she warned that in the light of the war on terror, quote, "Those who are shouting the loudest today to limit the rights and protections available to my clients include some who may find themselves on the other side of the law in the future." Our second guest is Dilar Dirik. Dilar is an activist of the Kurdish women's movement and a PhD candidate in the sociology department of the University of Cambridge. Her work examines the role of women's liberation in articulating and building freedom in Kurdistan. The Kurdish women's movement has been prominent from the early days of the Kurdish resistance. Rejecting the state as a patriarchal, imperialist, and capitalist construct, the women's movement and their development of genealogy, a women-centered science paradigm, formed a key factor in developing the philosophy and practice of stateless democracy in Bakur and Rojava. She regularly writes on the Kurdish freedom movement for the international audience. Before I go on, I'd like to announce that the Moral Economy will be hosting its own conference, the first Moral Economy Congress, from the 11th to the 13th of March in Pisselberg, outside of Hamburg, Germany. Officially, registration has ended, but as there are still places available, I invite anyone who is interested to contact me by Friday, the 5th of February. You can look at our website for more details, www.mainstreamidea.com.
So, welcome to the Moral Economy podcast from the New World Summit in Utrecht. I am your host, Navaz.
I'm your other host, Andrew.
I'm your other host, Firat.
And we have with us today Nancy Hollander, the self-proclaimed terrorist lawyer of the terrorists.
Lawyer of, you're right. I am not a terrorist. That was the whole point of that, was that because you represent people, because someone represents people who are accused of terrorism, that doesn't make us terrorists.
Right, you made the good point that, lawyers represent rapists and murderers and all types of people, and that doesn't make them rapists and murderers.
Right.
Yes.
So we are here with Nancy Hollander. My apologies again on record for putting it that way. It did not sound appropriate, but it just is.
We just have to make it clear.
Yeah, no, thank you. And we will ask Nancy, what does it feel, how her experience has been defending people locked up in Guantanamo, a place itself contested within international law, surrounded by much controversy. Despite the promises of President Obama, still not closed today. And she's represented some of the people held there. And, in other words, challenged the might of the American state. And we'll ask Nancy, what does it feel and what does she think of this whole exercise following the war on terror?
Guantanamo is a completely lawless place. It's a violation of international law to torture under any circumstances. And my clients were both tortured. So that's one thing. It's a violation of U.S. law to hold people without charging them with crimes. Mohamedou Al-Salahi has never been charged with a crime and has been there for 14 years. That's clearly a violation of U.S. law, and no doubt a violation of international law because there's no due process. And there are a lot of international instruments that require states to provide some process for their prisoners. It's also a unique prison because it's only open to foreigners, which again makes it a violation of law. We shouldn't have prisons that distinguish between citizens and foreigners. In the U.S., even if someone is completely illegal, gets into the U.S., sneaks in, gets charged with a crime, that person gets the same rights, trial rights, as a citizen. Those distinctions don't exist because it's the rights of the people under our Constitution. That doesn't apply in Guantanamo. The judges have specifically said there is no due process. The Constitution of the United States doesn't apply. So what does apply? It's hard to know. The rules change. They're inconsistent. One of the judges even said in one of the other cases that it was hard to know what the rules and laws were because they kept changing. And when a judge says that, you really got to wonder about it. So it's a very, very difficult situation for lawyers. And it puts lawyers, and this is something we've talked about as lawyers, in an ethical quandary. Should I really be representing someone when I can't provide the rights that I should be able to provide to him? And when Guantanamo first opened, we had big debates in the legal community about whether we should have anything to do with it. Should we have hands off? And at first, that seemed like the right decision. And then we realized that if we weren't there, nobody would be there. And the Center for Constitutional Rights, an NGO, and the American Civil Liberties Union created programs. And the one that I started with, not with Mohamedou, but with Ibrahim al-Nasri, was through the ACLU's John Adams Project. It's called the John Adams Project because John Adams was an American president and lawyer, I talk about in that op-ed piece, who represented British soldiers and said it was the finest point of his legal career. So that's how it got named the John Adams Project. I represent Mohamedou al-Salahi pro bono, which means completely for free, thanks to I'm grateful to my law partners who agreed to the urgency of this when we started 10 years ago. We never believed we'd be doing it 10 years later. And I don't know that Obama ever intended to close Guantanamo. He intends to move Guantanamo to the U.S. And that's not closing it. It will start a whole new fight for those who are still there about what rights are available in the U.S. It will be more difficult to argue they get no rights once they're actually in the U.S., on U.S. land. But I hope to get Mohamedou out before that happens. And I would like al-Nasri tried. He's facing the death penalty, al-Nasri. I would like him tried in a real court. And not in a military commission, which, and I've said this publicly, is really not a real court. It's a fake court. I'll tell you one other thing. In the U.S., we have a saying called kangaroo court. And I don't know if it means anything. Do you understand?
It does, of course.
It does. We wear, you can find a picture of me on somewhere, but we wear little kangaroos on our lapels to say to the judge, this isn't a real court. Okay. And yet they're trying to kill him.
Well, thank you, and great luck, best of luck with your cases that you're intending to pursue, defending your clients. Also, you raised a very good point in terms of the satellite status of the Guantanamo prison itself, because it's not in U.S. soil. So, according to the standard interpretation of the human rights law, it is individuals are entitled to basic human right protections. Correct me if I'm wrong. If they intend to be citizens of the country, on which soil their human rights are breached, or they are foreigners on the soil of this country. So you think if we move, if Obama or if the administration ever intends to move Guantanamo back to the U.S. soil, does this make it easier for people um, locked up there to receive at least a better chance at getting their rights defended?
Well, it may. If you look at the history of Guantanamo, it started in the Bush administration, and they thought, we put these people here, they'll never have lawyers, it's not the US, it's Cuba. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not correct. It is Cuban soil, but it's land that the United States leases from Cuba and has leased since 1903 from the Cuban government. It's a military base. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, these people get the right to petition for a writ of habeas corpus, which means that they get to demand to know why they're being held illegally. Then the government argued, well, they can make that demand, but that's all. They don't get any benefit. And the Supreme Court said again, no, that's really crazy thinking. They get all the protections of a writ of habeas corpus. If you can't prove that they're held illegally, you have to release them. So that then many people started filing these petitions. Mohamedou filed a petition, and we won. In 2010, the federal judge said, you've had this guy since you first captured him in 2001. You still don't have evidence to hold him. And you have to understand that this isn't a criminal case. It's not that they have a lot of evidence. They don't have to prove proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They just have to have a little evidence. Just tip the balance. They couldn't even do that. And the judge ordered him immediately released, 2010. The Obama administration appealed his case and every case that won. The Court of Appeals was convinced by the Obama administration's lawyers to make the standard for who is a part of Al Qaeda so broad and so loose that you can't win, basically. And the case went back, and it's been sitting there. So we have that going on. The other thing that's going on in Guantanamo now, which is important, is there's something called a periodic review board. This is something else that Obama did in 2011. It's what's called an executive order. He ordered that everyone there get a hearing, not to determine whether he was a part of Al Qaeda, but to determine whether he's a current threat to the U.S. right now. They were supposed to all have those by 2012. I started demanding them in 2012. They didn't even start the first one until 2013. Mohamedou's never had one. It's only a month ago that we got the first letter saying, okay, now he's going to get one, but we still don't have it yet. And people are slowly getting out. When they won't get through this process by the end of this term, it won't happen. So if Obama cannot convince Congress to agree to open a prison in the U.S., he can, by executive order, as Commander-in-Chief, say, I get to decide where detainees are held and I'm moving them. So that's a long history for the answer of your question, but I think it's important to understand where we are. I would argue, and many will argue, that now they're in the U.S., they're clearly on U.S. land once they get moved. Anyone who does get moved. You've got to treat them like you treat anyone else in the U.S. This is going to start, unfortunately, years of more of litigation, because we'll make those demands, the government will object, we'll go up through the courts, so this isn't going to really help people get out. What should happen, what would be the right thing to do, is to close Guantanamo. Anyone who can't be charged, hasn't been charged, should be released. You hold people because they might commit a crime sometime in the future. You know, there's a movie called, what was that movie about the people who committed crimes in Minority Report? The movie. Do you know this movie?
Yes.
Yeah. It's about arresting people who might commit crimes in the future. Well, that's what Guantanamo is.
Yeah.
They might commit a crime, so we're going to hold them. You either prosecute them under American justice, which is a good justice system when it works, right? Or you release them. End of story. Everything else is a violation of law, period.
So the
thank
system
you.
works not on the availability of sufficient evidence, but sufficient suspicion.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely.
And what do you think that all these illegalities surrounding the actions of the U.S. government and the U.S. law system, do you think that there is going to be any dramatic change anytime soon?
Not that I can see. You know, President Obama came into office and said, we're going to look forward, we're not going to look backward, which meant we're not going to prosecute any torturers. It's a crime in the U.S. to torture. It's a federal crime, in addition to a violation of human rights and a violation of international law. But none of those people are being prosecuted. And so that slate seems to be wiped clean. And I don't see that this is going to improve. If one of the Republicans gets in, they've already announced that they're going to expand Guantanamo. We know now that the military has dragged their feet on, in many ways, because there are people there who want to keep it open. For example, there's been quite a bit of news recently that delegations came from other countries to talk to the prisoners. You know, they wanted to know if these people could come, and one delegation wanted the prisoners' medical records. And the military said, no, you can't have him because that would make him a public curiosity. It's a violation of Geneva Convention, which of course they don't think applies. Think about that for a minute. And the prisoner said, no, they're my records. I want them to have them. Then the delegation said, well, we want to come for 3 days. And the military commander said, you have 1 hour. So they're constantly, the military is constantly putting roadblocks up. And it's the military, of course, who are prosecuting Mohamedou al-Salahi. It's the military who won't release him. All they have to do for him is to say, well, stop fighting this habeas that you filed. You won. We won't. We're finished. And he goes home tomorrow. He doesn't have to go home, go through Congress. He doesn't have to do anything. He's out of there.
There's something to be said, I think, that if we cannot extend these rights to these prisoners in Guantanamo, that eventually the rights can be taken away from Americans themselves. And I want to ask you, you know, how can we get the American public more informed about their rights and specifically about this problem?
It's very difficult to inform the Americans, and the difficulty is a lack of press. It's just right
Exactly.
there. That's where the problem is. You know, we have Fox alleged news, which isn't news. We have CNN, which, you know, never does anything on much on this.
Corporate news.
Well, we have corporate news, yes.
Corporate
We
news
have
network.
Al Jazeera America came,
Shut down.
but they're shutting down. That was the best news we had, but most Americans were afraid of it.
Yeah.
I'd ask people about it. Do you watch Al Jazeera? Oh no, that's terrorism.
Because Al Jazeera is associated with terrorism. Yeah.
Well, they just should have had a different name.
Yeah.
And they should have had something different than the Arabic symbol,
Symbolisms,
which is this
yeah.
symbol. It's like one of these,
The
right?
calligraphy.
Yeah, they should have figured out that if they wanted to come in, you got to use a little thought here. Let's call it something else. Nobody's going to read the little print at the bottom. This comes to you from Al Jazeera, Qatar. You know, if there was something else. So they're closing down. We have the BBC News, which hardly any Americans listen to. We have National Public Radio, which most Americans don't listen to. We don't really have much of a press.
Yeah.
We have, you know, the paper of record, the New York Times, And sometimes they do a good job. Sometimes they do a good job. The New York Times Book Review had Mohammedou's book on its cover. It was the cover. They've had repeated editorials in favor of closing Guantanamo. But how many Americans read the New York Times? I live in a building in Albuquerque, in a condo with 150 apartments. I'm the only one who subscribes to the New York Times in that building in Albuquerque. There may be one other person. There's one other person who reads the New York Review of Books, which just reviewed Salahi's book, because I talked to her. But, without a press, you don't get anywhere, and we don't have an informed public in the U.S. And I was thinking about this New World Summit and what would happen if we tried to do this in the U.S. And I think the people who would come would be people my age, not people your age. There'd be very few of you in that room. There wouldn't be anything like that.
Okay, it's thank you for that. It's interesting that you mentioned this as well. But one of your clients, Mohamedou Salahi, that you were representing, and you also assisted in publishing his bestseller, The Guantanamo Diaries. Why don't you tell us a bit about that for our listeners? For those of our listeners who don't know about this book at all.
But Guantanamo Diary began as letters to me in 2005. I first met Mohamedou in 2005, and he had already come through what we call the torture time, and he was now into some sort of minor rehabilitation. They were trying to help him get through what they had done to him, frankly. And he was in isolation, and he started writing these letters to me. And ultimately, we wanted to get them published. And we fought with the government for 6 years. We kept saying that, you see, the letters come to a lawyer. The government never read them because they were part of his attorney-client privilege. So he'd write the letter, seal it up, just like prisoners do all over the U.S., maybe in other parts of the world. Seal it up. It would come up to a room near Washington, D.C. I would get an email saying, we've received a letter from your client. So I could send someone there to read it and then ask them to clear it. And then it would go to something called a privilege team, who are separate from the prosecution, theoretically, and I think they are. And they would read it, and as long as they didn't think it, contained anybody's names or anything national security, then they would stamp it unclassified and send it to us. Or they would stamp it protected, which meant we could read it, but we couldn't show it to the press. These all came as protected, with redactions. But we kept fighting them and saying, that doesn't help. The court of public opinion is part of our job. It's our job to go to the public. This is part of what we do as lawyers. We didn't get anywhere. Finally, Mohamedou agreed to give up the privilege and let the government read all of it, which they had never done, which is, of course, what they wanted in the first place. So the whole 466 pages went to the government, and then it took them 2 years to get it back to us. And one day, out of the blue, I received a package saying, now you've got it. And that was in 2012. And we hired the editor, created the book. The book is now out in 22 countries. I just got the Japanese edition last week. And it's a bestseller in the U.S. It's a bestseller in the Netherlands. And we have 6 more, I think, in translation. There will be a movie. We're in contract negotiations for a movie. And the whole point was for the world to see what he wrote. That was the whole point. And the point is to get him out. He even said very early on when there was another kind of hearing they had called the Combatant Status Review Board hearings. They were these total kind of bull hearings. But he had one of those, I think in 2006, and that's public. And part of it is, and he says, I've written a book, you guys ought to read it, it's very interesting. And there's a lot, there's a lot that's been written about him. There were 2 prosecutors who've spoken about him, who said that he should be released. There are guards who contact me to this day saying, when is he going to get out? We just love this guy. And if you read the book, you see that he's not vengeful at all. He doesn't want vengeance. He's very religious. He's very smart. He wrote this in his 4th language. English is his 4th language. He speaks English, French, German, Arabic. Reads and writes, is fluent in all of them, and has now been learning Spanish from some of his guards, and he's been studying Turkish through some books. But he's got a degree in electrical engineering. But he understands that there are people who do good things and people who do bad things, and that everyone is an individual and should be treated as an individual. And there's not a person I've ever met in Guantanamo in all these years who will ever say anything bad about him. He's never had a disciplinary violation, which is very hard for a prisoner to get through that many years. And if you read the book, you see that the guards gave him some books, and they dedicated things to him. There's one, I'm sure he's an American Christian.
Just to inform you, they're getting started again. Feel free to stay here, just so you know.
There's an American Christian, I'm sure he's Christian, guard, who wrote in the book, Allah always has a plan. I don't know what his plan is for you. They gave him hats, signed their names to them. They really care about him, and he's really a special person, and he's totally 100% innocent. And I've said many times, he can come live with me if they want someone to watch out for him,
Okay,
We
thank
hope
you.
this will happen very soon.
Yeah.
I hope you see him.
We also hope to
hope
see
so.
him someday. Yeah.
We hope he comes back to Germany, actually.
Yeah. Well, we would.
He will have a place to stay.
Yeah, he will.
This
Yes.
is always well. Also, while we were talking about your clients, there's another famous client of yours that you were lead counsel to. That's Chelsea Manning, and I'm sure a lot of people know about her and also her crime.
And her crime was disclosing classified evidence and national security evidence, and she pled guilty to that, as you recall. The problem is for Chelsea that she received a sentence of 35 years, which is outrageous, given what she did, given the fact that she disclosed human rights abuses and violations of international law that we all had a right to know, but there's no defense for that. So that's a big problem. We're handling her appeal to the first court is the Army Court of Appeals, and we'll be writing a brief that we'll provide to that court probably in a few months. And then she gets another appeal to something called the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. The first court is a military court. They're all
Uniformed people.
Yeah.
military people. The second court is a civilian court, and then the U.S. Supreme Court. But she's in prison. I was there last week with her in Leavenworth, Kansas. And she writes for The Guardian. She writes for Amnesty. She wrote an article for Cosmopolitan. She's very active in helping us with her appeal. And she's really working very hard on keeping her mind. Plus, she has a whole separate case that the American Civil Liberties Union represents her on, and that's the gender demanding to get hormone treatment, which she now has, and she's been demanding to be able to let her hair grow, which they've been fighting.
Okay, and now that you touched upon this this whole notion, you also earlier when you spoke to us at the New World Summit, you mentioned the Espionage Act and its, so to speak, misuse which as you mentioned, most recently by the Obama administration, where you've had in the U.S. 8 convictions in 1 year, which has been the highest ever since the act was passed in
1917.
1917.
Not in 1 year, but in his term, the last 8 years that he's been a president.
My bad.
There have been 8 prosecutions, and that's more than there'd ever been since 1917. This law was hardly ever used, and it was used during the time of the Pentagon Papers, Vietnam, but hardly ever again. And all 8 of these people are people who have been trying to expose things, but their sentences are much lower than Chelsea's. One of them got 2 years, one got 1 year. And then you've got total disparity because you've got, for example, General Petraeus, who was a 4-star general, that's as high as it goes, who took documents from the president's daily briefings, which are very high clearance, much more than Chelsea's stuff was all confidential or secret or not cleared, not even classified. The president's daily briefings are top secret, and they're very, very secret.
For the president's eyes only, as they would say.
For president's eyes only, that's right. And his very close advisors. So he took those out of the office, that's a crime. He gave them to his girlfriend, that's a crime. He took them home, that's a crime. He lied to the FBI about it, that's a crime. And he pled guilty to a misdemeanor and got probation and lost his security clearance. And that's it. Now it's possible the Army's going to take away 1 star from him, which is kind of a big deal, I guess, in the military. But this is outrageous. You know, I'm glad that General Petraeus had a good lawyer and got out of it, but it just proves how ridiculous it was. If you're a general, what happens? If you're a private, what happens to you? And I think Chelsea was found not guilty of the most serious espionage crime, aiding the enemy, which could have resulted in life. Actually, it could result in a death sentence. But they early on said they weren't seeking death. She could have gotten life. The judge found her not guilty of that, which was the right decision because she wasn't. But then I believe she was sentenced as though she were guilty of that. And the government used it all the way through sentencing.
And what do you think of this if you would allow me to say, this way of classifying information, this arbitrary way of classifying information? Do you think it does help the American public, which you a few minutes ago already mentioned that they're very uninformed, and if they have certain sources of information which may be on the other side of the law, and which really, they somehow find it expedient to come out and tell people what their government is doing, because eventually the press and public opinion is something that a democracy really needs to function on, and it should treasure it, ensure it, respect it, secure it.
Well, that's true, and that's the other side of the problem, is the problem of overclassification. And I talked about this, and I talk about it a lot. The government has some legitimate secrets. It has secret sources and methods that it needs to keep secret. It has diplomatic secrets that it has a right to keep secret. But it's a violation of the whole classification process. Procedure is an executive order from the president. And the executive order says specifically that evidence and information cannot be classified for the purpose of avoiding embarrassment to the government. It's right in black and white. And yet, that's what they do. That's, why were the black sites classified? Why are the force-feeding videos classified? The government will claim that if these things are exposed, it will damage us because our enemies will get so much more angry at us. Well, they're already pretty angry. But you can't use classified evidence to cover up wrongdoing. So you can't use it to avoid embarrassment. You can't use it to cover up wrongdoing. And they've done both. And then you accuse someone who discloses it, something that shouldn't have been classified in the first place, or shouldn't have happened. But if it happened, should have fessed up to it. But the black sites would never have happened if they couldn't have been kept secret. Guantanamo would never have started if they thought they could keep it secret. They thought nobody will ever know. And what they didn't think about is how it was ever going to end. I don't think they ever thought about, what do we do later? Did they think they were just going to kill everyone? I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to know. But when you've got both, then you end up with a double problem. Too much is classified. You get prosecuted for disclosing classified evidence that shouldn't have been classified in the first place. And the concept of national security has been stretched. This is the other thing, maybe this is slightly off subject, but it's interesting. We were talking yesterday about self-defense, and I almost got up and said this, but I didn't want to veer the conversation in another direction. What is the meaning of self-defense? The United States government claims that the drones are self-defense because we are in imminent danger. Now, the word imminent, English word, I'm sure you know what it means. It means immediate danger. Well, the U.S. government uses the term immediate to mean sometime in the future they might come and get us. So we better kill them now.
Might, yeah.
That's really how it's been used.
You're absolutely right about it. I think about President Obama when he made this speech about his less known off foreign policy. He also used the word continuing. So it's both imminent and continuing. That is what their policy over this is driven by.
Yeah, so it hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen, but it's also already happening somehow.
Somehow or another, it's already happening.
Yeah.
And Al-Awlaki, who was killed in Yemen. The allegations were mostly that he was writing, and people were picking up his writings and using them, and that he told people how to make bombs. Well, that guy in Norway who killed so many people a couple of years ago.
Anders Breivik?
Yeah, he claimed that he had gotten some information from someone in the United States, these right-wing guys. And I remember at the time thinking, should we send a drone to Alabama or somewhere, Why is it different? Why is it different?
That's the same thing with these people occupying in Oregon, the militia. They've been recently arrested, but the same sort of logic
of self-defense?
Right. No, the logic, why aren't we, if we're going after terrorists, why aren't we going after them?
Right. Well, and of course, you can turn that around and say, not only are we doing it right with them, but we're doing it wrong with the others. And I think there's a tendency, and I said this the other day, and I've been caught up in it too. The white kid kills the black people in the church in the Carolinas. Most people would say, well, why isn't he a terrorist? Well, the answer is he isn't, and neither are the people who shot up their workplace. They're murderers. We don't need them to be terrorists. They're going to get life anyway, or get killed by the government for murder. So why do we need this? But if you listen to what those guys in Oregon are saying, it's pure, unadulterated treason. No question about it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point to make, that we overuse the term terrorists in the first place, misapply it, and then also we have good words for the things that people do.
I don't think we ever need the crime of terrorism. It is always a political decision.
Yes.
Always, 100% a political decision, whether to use it or not use it. I have clients from the Holy Land Foundation who are doing 65 years in prison for providing charity to Palestinian children. And they were convicted of material support for terrorism. There are people who support the Israeli settlers who go out and kill Palestinians. Those people aren't charged with material support.
That's a great example.
That's a
Yeah,
great
that's a really good
example,
example,
yeah.
And we know who they are. The government knows who they are. They may stop them from sending the money, but they're not prosecuting them. It's always a political decision to call someone a terrorist, to call an organization terrorist, to call a country a terrorist country. It's just unnecessary. That's why there's no international definition, because no one can agree on what it is.
It is not convenient to have a definition. Like, if there was a definition, then you would have to abide by that definition.
That's right.
Yeah.
And nobody wants to do that.
Yeah.
So it also serves the political purposes of of expediency, of convenience.
I mean, this came up when, for me, when I was at a training for the Tribunal for Lebanon, because I went to the training to become a lawyer in that, and that is a really screwed up court. But that's a court that's prosecuting people for the killing of basically one person and collateral damage.
President Hariri?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. One person and other people died, but it's a whole court set up, primarily by Saudi Arabia, I believe, to prosecute for terrorist acts. But terrorism is not defined anywhere. Anywhere.
Yeah, which is why there's this sentence that we often hear that one man's terrorist, another one's freedom fighter. Yeah.
I have a whole lecture that I did once on that subject, and I had a whole list of them. George Washington, Nelson Mandela, Itzhak Rabin. There's a poster that I found, wanted for terrorism, Itzhak Rabin, by the Brits, right? And he gets the Nobel Prize.
Peace Prize, yeah.
Right. Yasser Arafat, considered a terrorist, gets the Nobel Peace Prize. There's just any number of people you can find who one point are terrorists, the next point aren't, or at the same time that one side calls them a terrorist, the other side calls them a freedom fighter. So it just doesn't have any meaning.
Well, Noam Chomsky famously points out that the United States Army does have a definition for the terrorists in their manual. But if you use this definition, then United States Army is a terrorist organization.
Right. He's probably right.
So yeah,
I think that was
Is
a very, very.
Is that helpful? Those are kind of long, but I figured
that was very helpful. That's
perfect.
use what you want to use.
That is how these podcasts go, and we go
We
on
just
for a very
converse.
long
You like
time.
them to be long.
We
Yeah.
just converse
Yeah.
and we talk, and one comes out of it.
It's helpful to have the background for these things, especially if you're somewhere where people don't know.
Yeah.
But everyone should buy the book. The book is available in German.
In fact, I think I'm going to go over there and get the book
Yeah,
if
we can
one
do
of
that.
these
Yeah.
people will give me some money.
Yeah, we should also do that. Moral economy.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was us from the New World Summit in Utrecht with Nancy Hollander. Thank you very much, Nancy, for talking to us,
You're
for
welcome.
taking your time,
and it was a
and-
pleasure talking to you. And
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
we wish you all the best with your campaign,
Thank
crusade
you.
for defending your flags and
Thank you.
being a voice of justice and sanity in this lawless world that you are up against. All the best to you.
Yeah, well, I get to
Thank
fight the
you.
government every day. That's my job.
Yeah, we envy you.
Sometimes I get paid for it.
When it's all said and done, you will find no place to hide.
everybody. This is our second dispatch from the New World Summit in Utrecht. I am your host, Fırat.
I'm your other host, Andrew.
And I'm your other host, Nabaz.
And for this dispatch, we have Dirik from Kurdish Women's Movement with us. And we would like to ask her a few questions about the recent developments that have made headlines, especially the Geneva talks, the third Geneva talks that are supposed to take place very soon, and PYD's exclusion, any lack of Kurdish representation actually on the Geneva table, and about the war that is going on in northern Kurdistan, in southern Turkey. And yes, Dilar, thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me.
Join our podcast. What do you think Geneva will result in, the third Geneva?
Actually, I think the third Geneva conference will result in exactly what it's supposed to result in, which is no solution to the war in Syria, because it's obvious that those who claim to want a peaceful solution to the conflict in Syria, and for this reason invite those who have caused the war in Syria, but not those who propose a solution to it, that already shows us, it illustrates very clearly that the goal of these talks is not a real solution to the conflict in Syria. I mean, we can look at the fact that those who have actively supported different radical groups, not just groups like Daesh, but all kinds of other reactionary groups, and like either financially, logistically, politically, countries such as Turkey, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, as well as jihadist groups, we can say, are now present in the talks. They have been invited formally, but those who have dedicated their last couple of years to actively fighting the so-called Islamic State, and who have also opposed the system of the regime, who have, together with all communities in that region and with women playing a pioneering role, because obviously those who have suffered the most from this war are the women, especially under Daesh, but also under the regime which uses rape as a systematic tool of war. We can say that excluding those people while inviting those who are like on the roots of all these conflicts is a clear message to the fact that these people, these powers who organize the conference are not really interested in a solution. Because we have seen actually during the fight for Kobani, the battle for Kobani, how Rojava became a perspective for anti-system movements around the world, for women around the world, for struggling people, for the peoples of Syria, but also beyond that in the Middle East and internationally. And I think it's an attempt to suffocate this perspective, this potential perspective, ideologically. Because, I mean, 2 years ago there was the Geneva II talks, which also excluded the Kurdish people, who make up around 10% of the population approximately. And at that time they had already started to build democratic autonomy in Rojava. The same week the people there, together, not just the Kurds, but the Arabs, the Christian peoples, the different Christian peoples, the Chechens, the Armenians, the Turkmen who are living there together, drafted a social contract and also declared their 3 autonomous cantons, Kobani, Afrin, and Cizre, at the same time. And last year, at the same time, also in January, on the first anniversary of the cantons, Kobani was liberated from Daesh, even though everyone was hoping that Kobani would fall. And now this year, again in January, we see another exclusion. So it's obvious what's the interest behind this conference are. And I think what's Ilham Ahmed, she was supposed to be on the Rojava delegation had they been invited. She said something very important, I think. She said our opposition, our solution will be inside Syria. Like, we do not rely on talks in Geneva with those who, like, of course it would have been important to be represented there, but it will not begin with Geneva and it will not end there. So the real solution has to be found with the forces inside Syria. You cannot have an opposition cherry-picked outside, and you can also not have a system that is appeasing the regime or reactionary forces there. So I think no matter what happens, the project in Rojava will continue, maybe even stronger, because we can see a very clear attack on this perspective from the international community.
And what other alternative platforms are there available for PYD specifically, and also the other democratic forces who are being excluded from the discussion about the future of Syria?
I mean, as we said before, it's important to build alliances within these communities, right? Nobody should hope for a solution coming from outside to be granted from the West or international institutions. What's really important and crucial for the people who live in a geography where there's just such a mosaic of peoples who have lived there together for millennia, to build alliances among each other. So in that sense, the foundation of the Syria Democratic Forces, who have fought together, like who have shed blood together to fight and defend their country, which is an alliance of Kurds, Arabs, and Christian peoples, and so on. That's like one important step, but that's like a military alliance, of course, but also the internal structures of Rojava, the way in which it is inclusive towards all communities there. This is another platform of struggle. The fact that people from across Syria, from across different parts of the region, come to see whether this could be an alternative, because the project of democratic autonomy, instead of a nation-state system, and the Syrian state has been a very centralistic pan-Arab regime, which has didn't deny the existence of different identities the way maybe Turkey did, but it did destroy different communities. So in that sense, against this idea of this centralized monopolistic state, the people need to build grassroots structures, and I think they are doing that. When we can see this in the political structures of Rojava, we can see it from the fact that internationalists around the world have joined this movement. We can see that it's also transnational. I mean, the same things that is happening in Turkey. We must not disconnect what's happening in Turkey from what's happening in Syria and other parts of the region. So in that sense, alternative diplomacy, people's diplomacy, as the people call it there, that's what's important to build trust, empathy, alliances between the different communities. Because what the system is doing is exactly that, trying to incite hatred and destruction and mistrust between especially Kurds and Arabs, between Kurds and Turks, between Turks and Arabs, and so on. So it's a vicious circle, and the only way to defeat that, if we really want justice and peace, not just isolating ourselves and defending our borders all the time, is not to create more borders, but to build bridges between these different communities. Because actually the nation-state system is less than 100 years old in the Middle East, and reinforcing that system will not bring us very far.
But I just wanted to follow up on that. I know you're a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge in sociology, and I just wanted to be a little more, let's say, academic about this. You do make a very good point about the fact that the nation-state system in the Middle East is a very recent phenomenon, and the people in the Middle East, especially the Kurds, the way they've been divided in 4 different states as a result of the imperial division following the First World War and the Second World War. How would you imagine this if this was done another way? What I understand that the Kurdish movement is around ideals of democratic confederalism, but we have to face the reality of the world, which is that the political space of the world is divided among independent states, multinational, unionist, unionist. But my question would be, and not a question but a remark, and I want you to enlighten us on this. How do you see this? Because this is what makes the Kurdish question also very particular. It has no, as far as I understand, or also correct me if I'm wrong, it has no parallel with any other nationalist movement in the world. That Kurds are taking on for different national identities following this evolution, and that is, I think, the most hop chop that has ever been. But still Kurds, as opposed to, let's say, the Jewish example, following the Second World War. The Jews, although they were given guarantees of rights, but they insisted on having their own nation state, because there still is this sense of security that a nation state gives to a community, to a peoples. But surprisingly and very interestingly, the Kurds, in their dominant movement, they do not demand that. They do not demand, as I understand it, they do not demand a state of their own. They demand autonomy in the areas that they already live in, with or without a state, if I understand that correctly. And that is what makes it different. And tell us, how do you see this?
Yes, I mean, obviously, we should never forget that what statelessness is doing to people, right? Because so many genocides, massacres, historic denials have taken place because people are stateless, and statelessness has been one of the main sources of destruction around the world. And I mean, there's many different people struggles that are telling of that. So in that sense, we of course, when we talk about statelessness or whether we should struggle without a state. First of all, we do recognize, for example, that the Kurds, according to like international agreements or whatever, of course it's important to know who is writing those international agreements, they do have the right to self-determination, even a state, according to the dominant discourse of the system. So in that sense, it's interesting to see how the same system is contradicting itself, but it's meant to contradict itself in many ways. So we do see what statelessness is doing, but then we need to analyze and ask: is it the statelessness that is the problem that causes the oppression, or is it the state itself? Like, what makes a state? How did it emerge? I think when we want to analyze the structure of the state with all of its institutions, we need to look at the emergence of it. And in that sense, the fact that, I mean, I'm not saying that the empires before the nation states were like so much better or that they were democratic. I'm not saying that at all. But the nation state has added another ideological layer and has kind of, in the name of modernity, especially, tried to divide communities even more and really created a monopoly of ideology under the name of nation, which is a lot more denying existing realities than like empires had. So in that sense, it generated, there was already oppression, but it generated it and brought it to another level. And the current system is legitimizing it over and over again. I mean, you can look at the fact the UN refugee agency, for example, they're supposed to be in charge of protecting refugees and so on, but they only recognize states, and the states, I mean, whose borders were drawn by imperialist powers like the French and the British, who now do not want to accept these refugees. So the UN system is reinforcing these nation-state borders, which cause all these people to flee and to seek asylum and not receive asylum. So in that sense, we need to problematize all these things. And the Kurdish people, especially during the time of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there have been several Kurdish nationalistic modernist movements that said, you know, the Kurds also deserve an own state, because this was the time of the building of republics and nation states in the Middle East. But these were not like organic people. Like, the nation states always claimed to be the rule of the people, right, rather than a king or a religion. They always claimed in Europe as well, when they were established, that this is the people now ruling, the nation now, the nation is the sovereign. But it's obvious that it was always just a economically privileged elite that benefited from the rule in the nation-state systems. So in that sense, there were attempts within the Kurdish people as well to create a state, and they used, interestingly, you know, modernist language to say, look, we're so much more progressive than our other neighbors, so the West should give us a state. So it was always this demand from outside. But actually, it's interesting to also note that there was never this pan-Kurdish sentiment in the Kurdish geography. There were, because the Kurds are more tribally structured, they are more, you know, they've had a centuries-long history of actually struggles against centralist regimes, either in the Ottoman Empire or outside of that, and also most recently in the nation state. It was always against centralism, because in the social makeup of the Kurdish people, the centralism is not present, because they're more loyal to their village, to their family, to the local structures, to their cities. If you ask a Kurd, where are you from, they don't, like, maybe in the last couple of decades that this has been the case, that they say, well, I'm from Kurdistan, but actually which village they come from is more important to them. So in that sense, we can see very clearly this nation-state idea had to be even constructed in the heads of the Kurdish people. It wasn't even present. So, and now if you look at the fact that there are different political projects in Kurdistan. For example, if you look at Iraqi Kurdistan, you can see this is a very much nation-state oriented political discourse that's dominant. But does it liberate the people? No, you see two families basically being in charge of the government, of the economy, of the parliament, of the armed forces even. So it's and the people are constantly protesting against their own government. They never dreamed that they would ever have a Kurdish, state-like institution and had to protest against it because it's actually really suffocating the people. So we have actually in Kurdistan an experience with statehood, if you want, even if it's not. It functions. It performs the function of a state. But the movement around ideologically affiliated with the PKK, which has then become like a social movement under the umbrella of democratic confederalism, we can see that it is really truly empowering to the people, because now it is the people who get to form their communes, their councils, their congresses, and now you see the most marginalized, the most excluded, the poorest people being for the first time in charge of their own lives. And in Rojava, this is what you will see. It's really, you just walk in the streets and you see there's a neighborhood assembly where people discuss things like electricity, like energy, like water, like peace committees between like different neighborhood disputes. So in that sense, the system is very different. And actually, I mean, this has just been implemented over the last couple of years in Rojava and in the midst of a war. But still, you see how it attracts the people, because it is really for the people, because it's so decentralized. It's really face-to-face democracy, if you will. It's the most radical form of democracy. So in that sense, and especially what I think is, of course, of interest to me as a Kurdish woman is how these different understandings of freedom, these different political projects, how they influence the situation of women. And if you look at how the political participation of women in Iraqi Kurdistan looks like, as opposed to how it looks like in Rojava, and if you think about the fact that maybe we should measure the liberation of a society by the degree of women's freedom, I think you can tell a lot of stories about that. So in that sense, the emergence of the state, which actually began in Mesopotamia, the first state this is what historians say, was created in Mesopotamia. And this is at the same time where private property was concentrated in that state, in that empire. This is the same time where knowledge was monopolized in the hands of men through the priests at that time, who then did their best to destroy the role of women in the society. This is also the same place where prostitution was actually begun, or is believed to have begun, where the first distinction in the society between honorable, so-called honorable and non-honorable women was made. So it's really interesting to see the links between private property, state-like systems, centralized hierarchies and institutions, and patriarchy. So in that sense, we can analyze it in many different ways, sociologically, historically, politically. And I think the fact that so many people in Rojava, not just Kurdish people, but like the peoples in that region, when I was there for my PhD, actually, I did interview Christian peoples, the Syriac community. I interviewed Arab people who were also in the armed forces, women from different communities. And they felt so naturally attracted to it, because it was, of course, there's so much mistrust that has been constructed between these communities, but they actually feel like this is a return to a time where there was no officially legitimized hatred between different communities, which is basically what the nation state is doing. It draws borders and says, you are different from me. So undoing these borders starts with mentality, really. And I think democratic confederalism and the system of democratic autonomy can perhaps be a contribution to it.
Thank you. Very well said.
I would like for you to elaborate on this. You brought up the role of women in the various Kurdish movements, and also made the connection between patriarchy and the nation state. And I'd just like you to elaborate on that, and also maybe I'd like to ask, what are the obstacles to liberation of women from nation states and also from within the Kurdish movement itself?
Yeah. Very good question. I mean, even within the Kurdish freedom movement, women had to do a huge fight to get where they are today. Because the women understood that nobody will grant them their freedoms. Just like we say, nobody will grant your country or your people, your language, your freedom. You can also not expect men to give you freedom all of a sudden, because men benefit from a system that is masculine in the hands of men, legitimized through history writing, science, through media. We just have to look around us, and we will see that. So in that sense, it's quite obvious, I think, to see how women always suffer multiple layers of oppression. If we look at the situation of women in Kurdistan, they were even excluded from the feminist movements in these countries. Like Turkish feminists have said, okay, in order to benefit from the women's rights that the Republic is bringing, you first of all have to be Turkish woman. So they excluded Kurdish women because they were not Turkish, because they were not subscribing to the state feminism. Because how can state feminism even be feminism? So, but at the same time, they've also suffered from national liberation movements in Kurdistan, who either said, on one hand, we do have
I think Dilar is short on time.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe we can ask her to just wrap up the current situation in Bakur, North Kurdistan, and what democratic confederalism can do for the Kurdish people in Turkey.
Okay. So basically, what we see in Turkey, in Bakur, happening at the moment is, we can say that the Kurdish people are being punished by the state for having participated in the few democratic structures that still exist. I mean, there was a peace process for 2.5 years, and then the elections took place, and before the elections there was already an environment of intimidation. But what then happened in some areas like Cizre, people voted like more than 90% for the People's Democratic Party, which means basically almost everyone in that place says, I hate the state, I hate this government, and I do not accept this government. So of course this is a huge threat for the state, but already the state already knew what the position of the people in that place is. But the Kurds made the effort, they did vote in the elections, they did manage to pass the 10% threshold. This was the first time in history where in a parliament that subscribes to this doctrine of one nation, one language, one religion, it's like everyone in this country is a Turk, that you now have Armenians, Kurds, Assyrians, Yazidi, Alevi, Sunni, atheists, LGBT, maybe not LGBT people, but in the candidates, there were LGBT candidates. So this is the first time you see something like that, this kind of makeup, this diversity represented in this monopolistic parliament. This, of course, this itself, the fact that 10% of the parliament is now consisting of these kinds of people, of the real people, like the real reflection of the society, this was a huge threat to the government. And we can say that just like what Daesh did in Kobani, the Turkish army is doing in the Kurdish regions, especially in those Kurdish regions that have voted the most against the government. So in that sense, also the ideologies of this of the nation state of Turkey and Daesh, which is based on like one domination, one-sided domination, and the project that the Kurdish movement posed as an alternative, we can see the diversity of Rojava and the diversity of HDP are very much linked together. Both are trying to build a bridge between different communities. Both have women at the center of their struggles. Ideologically, they're very close to each other, but also the methods that they use. I mean, now the Turkish state is dragging dead bodies through the cities like they did in the 90s. And I don't know, is it possible to say Daesh has learned from the Turkish army or vice versa, because they reinforce each other. So in that sense, we must not forget that the Turkish army and state are doing this also in reaction to what is happening in Rojava, and vice versa. So the fact that this idea is spreading, that the people do get inspiration from each other, that these borders are no longer valid, I think everyone understands that. I saw a video where a Daesh member was kind of like, he's at the spot where there used to be the Iraqi-Syrian border, and he says, no more Sykes-Picot, and the Kurds also never accepted Sykes-Picot, and everyone knows, the whole world knows that this agreement is no longer valid, because these borders do not exist anymore in a meaningful way like that than they did before. So in that sense, the Middle East is changing. It is changing, and it has to change. But now it's up to the people to decide in which way it should go. It can either go worse, the ethnic cleansing and monopolism agenda of these nation states, but also of institutions like Daesh, feel like they threaten to just kill all the colors of the Middle East and turn it into one monolithic block. But on the other hand, you have those who struggle for a mosaic of the Middle East, where everyone is existing on an equal level. So in that sense, what's happening in Turkey will also affect, what's happening in Bakur will affect the Turkish people. The people in Istanbul, I've seen photos on social media of demonstrators who said, if the sun doesn't rise in the east, it will not set in the west. It will not come. So in that sense, the liberation of the Kurdish people also means the liberation of the Turkish people. If you have a war in the east of the country and modern shopping malls in Istanbul, what use is it? There is also this very famous poem. I don't know exactly how it is, but it says something like, first they came for the Jews and I didn't do anything because I was not a Jew. And then they came for the socialists and so on. It's the same thing. So it's now. It cannot get worse than the Middle East. Now is the time for the people to rise up and form an alternative platform. So in that sense, I think we must really link and understand the links between everything that is going on in the Middle East at the moment. The fact that there's these either Shiite or Sunni blocs, the either pro or anti-America blocs and so on. We must forget these blocs and understand that they all have the same mentality actually. It's of no use to position yourself on either side. That's why the Kurds in Rojava with the other peoples have said we want a third way. That's why HDP has also said we want a third way. And this third way hopefully can be a perspective for the peoples in the Middle East, and I think we already can see that this has inspired struggles around the world, and hopefully we can build practical steps towards a more peaceful solution.
Thank you, Dilar.
Gerek spas Dilar. Thank you very much.
Spas hoş.
We are short on time now. The conference is entering its last session, and we will follow that. Thank you very much for our listeners.
Get back
See you in another podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So was this live actually?